Is there a good reason to think Christianity is true? One theist thinks there is, but we're halfway through that, and so far, it's just not looking good. However, things can change, and I'm happy to give it another go. So, can we find a good reason, a convincing reason, a rational reason, a reason actually backed up by anything remotely evidential, to think that Christianity is true and Jesus rose from the dead? Let's go see. Let's finish up our evaluation of the Epitomes video, actually recommended to me by the creator, for which I am very thankful. Thank you for sending this in. If any other theists want me to take a critical look at their videos, just post a direct link to them in the comments, and I'll just add it to the list. Now, I can't guarantee that I'll do all of them, and there is a considerable lead time, but I will do my best to give it a gander, and maybe it'll show up on the channel. So with that out of the way, let's dive right back in.
If you were to ask the followers of Jesus, they would have all given you the same answer, that he rose from the dead.
You have absolutely no way of knowing that. You are just shoving words into their mouths. This, I find, is very common with people pushing a particular narrative, and it happens today. But everybody thinks this. No, they don't. Go ask them. This is not about actual truth. This is about agenda. It's about spin. You have to remember that the followers of Jesus were a very, very, very small number of people at the time. Christianity didn't become important until the time of Constantine, hundreds of years later. So if you were going to go out and ask that question of your average man on the street in the first half of the first century Jerusalem, that is not the answer that you'd be getting, because Christianity was at best a minor cult following a supposed failed apocalyptic preacher at best. Most likely, very few people had ever heard of him at all and didn't know anything about Christianity. So I don't buy it. Not for a second.
This brings us to our second fact, which is the first century conception of resurrection for the Jewish people. The Jews believed that there would be one bodily resurrection at the end of the world.
Yes, they did. And when this Jesus character, which we can't even prove ever existed at all, but let's just assume it for the sake of argument, and you know how much I hate that term, but if this Jesus guy got hung on a stick by the Romans, then his followers had to move fast and try to explain, in the light of the things that the Jews already believed, why Jesus was still supposedly their guy. And that's why Matthew in particular, or whoever wrote Matthew, since we know it was written anonymously, but he had to go back into the Jewish scriptures and reinterpret things that were never intended to be prophetic as prophecies that he could twist to seemingly refer to Jesus. That's what actually went on. The Jews were expecting a great king or a military leader that would come and save them from their troubles, and at that time that was the Roman occupation. They did not expect someone who would die and rise again from the dead. So whoever wrote the Gospels, and we still don't know who any of those people were, they had to create the impression that this fit in with what the Jews already believed. Unfortunately, they did so very badly, because most Jews didn't convert to Christianity, even to this day.
To summarize their view, they believed that when you died, you remained in the grave until the end of the world, where your soul would return to your body and you would have a new bodily life.
Yup, and Christianity, they just made up a different paradigm. All religions do this. Joseph Smith came up with the idea that Mormons would go to heaven and become gods in their own right if they followed the precepts of Mormonism. It doesn't matter where he got the idea. He could have just made it up, It could have come to him in a dream. We'll never know. But he just took one view of Christianity, he added in his own ideas, and he came up with an entirely new religion, just like Paul primarily did with Judaism when he heavily modified the fledgling Christianity into something that I guess he liked better. Therefore, whoever wrote the Gospels, they further came up with new ideas that they meant to appeal to the existing Jews, and it worked to some degree, although not, as I already said, for the vast majority of Jews who just rejected it even to this day. This is exactly how religions evolve. It's not truth, it's delusion and dishonesty.
This helps us understand Martha's response to Jesus in John chapter 11. If you don't remember, Lazarus, her brother, had been dead for 4 days. In verse 23 and 24, we get this exchange. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise from the dead." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day."
This is all just mythology, and I don't tend to go through Bible readings because the Bible has never been justified to be demonstrably accurate at all in pretty much anything, especially when you get to the supernatural stories. I honestly don't know that this is at all worthwhile, but we'll see just how long it goes on. I might shift into fast forward mode if I feel it's getting too preachy and off topic. This is just the gospel writer, whoever the hell they were, trying to shift expectations from what the Jews already believed to what the Christians were trying to push. That doesn't prove anything other than that humans are manipulative. I mean, what the hell else is new?
It's also important to mention that there were a lot of questions and debates around this doctrine around the first century. People were asking if you were going to be married in heaven, if your new body was going to be corruptible or incorruptible, and things like this.
Some of those debates are still going on today, but it's all really irrelevant since there's no reason whatsoever to think that there is a heaven or an afterlife in the first place. That's where the religious really have problems because their doctrines are based on wishful thinking, not demonstrable fact. I don't care what you want to happen. I don't care what anyone says. I care what they can prove and provide demonstrable evidence for, and that's where they really fail because they can't prove any of it. They don't have any evidence for any of it. They can just make empty assertions. They can just make claims without support that are conveniently placed beyond any ability for us to verify. Nobody has ever demonstrably come back from the dead to tell us what's on the other side. So all the claims in the world mean absolutely nothing. That's why they have to take it all on faith. And I'm sorry, but faith is completely useless.
And it was also a tertiary doctrine, meaning that it wasn't a very important one. The Jewish people's main doctrine and focus was that God had revealed the Torah to them, and they were supposed to be a light to the world because of this revelation that they had received.
And as I said, they were doing a really bad job of it. You have to remember that everything the Jews were doing, and are still doing to this day, were just hand-me-downs. Their God was borrowed, in the Joseph Campbell style, from other pantheons. If they're supposed to be a light to the world, then why do they spend so much time getting abused? Why do they spend so much time throughout history getting their asses kicked? It really sounds like a gigantic set of excuses for why things aren't going well for the Jews. Maybe, just maybe, they're just a shit culture, who knows? Because at the end of the day, the Jews have never done anything particularly of note as a religion. Individual people? Sure. The Jewish religion? Well, it's always been a niche belief and it always will be. That is not very impressive at all.
So, how did the topic of resurrection go from a tertiary doctrine before the time of Christ to the very center of Christian theology in as little as 20 years after Christ in Paul's letters?
It's actually very common in other neighboring religions from the region. We can find references in Egyptian and Canaanite writings which speak of the dying and rising gods such as Osiris and Baal. The ancient Greeks generally spoke of immortality, but we can still find references to men and women who rose from the dead and were made physically immortal in the process. You can find resurrections among the Dharmic religions, and in Buddhism and Hinduism, reincarnation is very, very common among those peoples, because all of these religions were known in the region at the time. So it's not at all surprising that such a belief might be adopted into this new burgeoning religion, especially given that their leader, whether he ever existed or not, was said to be put to death. It's not a very convincing claim if your Messiah is dead, so they had to find a way to bring him back, and that was just make shit up.
Every early Christian document, creed, and church father centered their teaching around bodily resurrection. This sudden shift in focus demands an explanation.
And I've already given one. You have to remember that Christianity was just a cultic offshoot of Judaism, and if we look at other cultic offshoots of Christianity, this exact same thing happens. You can look at Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness theology, and it is quite different than mainstream Christianity, to the point that a lot of Christians simply refuse to accept them as just another denomination of their own religion. However, we can look at some other more severe offshoots. The Branch Davidians, which started off as a radical sect of Seventh-day Adventists, or the People's Temple, started by Jim Jones, and you'll find that they have one thing in common: a charismatic leader that suddenly makes changes and inspires people to follow him. This happens outside of Christianity as well. There is Osho, a cult in India led by Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Some have made the argument that Baha'i is an outgrowth of Islam. There's a lot of examples that we can come up with, so Christianity is hardly alone. New cultic offshoots appear all the time in any major religion, and even a lot of minor ones. Christianity just isn't special.
And here's my contention. I contend that in order to explain this sudden change in the minds of this early Christian movement on the topic of resurrection, without appealing to the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, you will have to contrive a narrative that neglects some of the data we have, or you'll posit some data which we have no evidence for, or you'll tell a self-contradictory story while trying to be consistent with the data.
Except I've already done that without any of the above. Because he, like a lot of theists, has to insist that their stories are true without providing any evidence whatsoever that their stories are actually true. We can go right back to Elvis because we know that people were seeing Elvis immediately after his burial in 1977. The very first sighting that we have any records for is the day after he died at the Memphis International Airport, where a man that looked like Elvis gave the name John Burroughs, which is the name that Elvis used when he was booking hotels. There were sightings in Michigan in the 1980s, and even multiple sightings at the opening of Legoland in 1999. Although there, the park admits that they did hire Elvis impersonators, but many people still firmly believe that Elvis's death in 1977 was a hoax. And of course, the Weekly World News ran stories of Elvis sightings for years. The simple fact is, people tell stories. We know that post-bereavement hallucinations are a thing. People can think that they saw a loved one that has been lost, even if they really didn't. None of this means anything, especially given the fact that you can't even prove that Jesus existed at all, or that the stories told in the Bible, all written by anonymous non-eyewitnesses, mean anything whatsoever. You have to assume a whole lot of stuff that is clearly not in evidence. Thanks, Allison, for that. Sorry, I'm just not impressed.
This contention does contain an implicit assertion that the resurrection hypothesis is the most parsimonious with the data that we have, and is the least ad hoc of our options.
And you're wrong, because miracle claims will never be most in line with other information. Never. You have to take that part on faith, and faith doesn't mean anything. Faith doesn't get you anywhere. Your faith doesn't convince anybody else that your faith is true. It doesn't matter what you really want to be true, only what is demonstrably true matters, and you have no objective demonstration for anything. Mistakes, lies, and hallucinations, things for which we have actual evidence, are a much better explanation and always will be. I'm sorry, that just doesn't fly, except in the minds of people who are already desperate to believe stuff that they've just been brainwashed into believing.
Our third and final fact that makes it utterly surprising that Christianity still exists today is the fact that Christians were horribly tortured and even killed for the claim that Jesus bodily rose from the dead.
Some of that is true. Some of it is just assumption. A lot of the claims about the supposed disciples are just church tradition with no actual data to back it up. Besides, it doesn't really matter because we can point to other religions where the exact same thing happens. Just because you are convinced of a thing, that doesn't make that thing real. The 9/11 hijackers all died because they believed in Islam. But that doesn't mean that Islam is true. Dying for a lie happens all the time. 39 people died in Heaven's Gate suicide pacts because they really believed that a UFO was coming to take them away in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet. That doesn't make it true. It doesn't matter how strongly you believe a thing. Your conviction doesn't prove the veracity of your beliefs. Then there's like the good walkers who were part of a cult in northern Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries. They believed they could astrally project out of their bodies and fight evil witches in order to guarantee a fruitful harvest in the fields. Of course, they were persecuted by the Catholics and often murdered because that's kind of what Christians did. Did those people die for a lie? Apparently so. We can go on and on and on and on and on with examples of people who died for things that they firmly believed, things I'm sure this guy would claim were false, and there were no double standards there at all. So either crop-destroying witches actually exist, or his own claims are complete bunk. Pick one.
I actually have an entire series on early Christian persecution and why I think it happened, and there's good evidence for it. You can click on the card above to get a fuller and deeper dive into that topic.
No one doubts that Christians were persecuted or that Christians persecuted other religions, because they absolutely did. That's a matter of established history. It doesn't prove that any of the things that Christians or other religions that were persecuted by Christianity or any other religions who have ever been persecuted or have persecuted others, that doesn't demonstrate that any of the things that they believe, any of the things that they've had faith in, were actually true. That's the whole point. If someone claimed to believe that invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies were real, and they were willing to die for that belief, or they were willing to dedicate their lives to preaching that belief, or whatever, that doesn't prove that that belief is true. And I've seen theists making all kinds of claims that nobody would ever do this or that or whatever if it wasn't all true, and that still doesn't make the claims true. It's all a matter of faith, and the truth is what matters, and the truth isn't proven by the belief, only by the evidence, and I'm sorry, but this guy has no actual evidence to support any of the claims he's making. He's really just making the argument from popularity or the argument from consequences, because there's a lot of fallacious ways to get there, but none of it actually demonstrates anything. None of it actually provides any evidence that any of it is true. And that's the problem.
For this video, I simply want to point out that people will not suffer and die for views that they know are false.
That's demonstrably wrong. There are plenty of cases that we could bring up where people died for something that they knew was wrong, but that they thought would benefit someone else. I mean, how many parents have taken the blame for crimes committed by their children, claiming that they did it when their children didn't? But yeah, that's not really where he's going, so let's just skip over that. What he's really missing here is that they didn't have to know that it was a lie. They just had to believe that it's the truth. Believing that it's the truth doesn't make it the truth. We can point out tons and tons and tons of examples here as well, and in fact, I've already done so. Just because you believe it, that doesn't make it true. So let's just assume for the sake of argument that all of this stuff is true, that there was a Jesus, that he was crucified by the Romans, that there were disciples, yada, yada, yada. The disciples really believed that Jesus was magic. There are numerous examples of cults where that was true and people have died for those beliefs, as we've already said. Does that mean that those beliefs were factually correct? No, absolutely not. It only means that they believed it. You still have all of your work ahead of you if you want to get from, well, they believed a thing, to that thing that they believed actually happened. And how do you propose to do that? Because I'm sorry, but I'm just not seeing any of it.
The earliest apostles would know whether or not they were lying about the resurrection.
Except you have no demonstrable accounts from the earliest apostles. The Gospels were all written anonymously by people who clearly were not eyewitnesses. Actual eyewitnesses wouldn't need to copy from other people's work like the Gospel writers did. Over 90% of the contents of Matthew is copied straight from Mark. Luke copies more than 50% of his own content from Mark, with another large amount coming from Matthew. Paul was never an eyewitness to anything by his own admission. He just had a drug trip on the road to Damascus. So you have no demonstrable eyewitness accounts for anything, anywhere. You cannot prove that anyone actually saw anything. This is all just stories, and you are taking your own blind faith as evidence that any of it is actually true. And I'm sorry, that's just not how this works.
And the fact that there is no evidence of any kind that the apostles ever recanted, and we know that early Christians were persecuted and killed for their beliefs, this gives us incredibly strong reasons to believe that Christianity is in fact true.
No, that's just laughable. First off, you can't say that none of them recanted. Just because you don't have evidence that they did, that doesn't mean they didn't. That's not how logic works. Secondly, in a lot of what he's saying, that's just church traditions. It's stories that the church tells because the church had a vested interest in telling those stories. The church has a vested financial interest in keeping itself going. So, my church said a thing, that doesn't mean that the thing that your church said is actually true. This is just an assertion that you can't back up at all. And before you say, but you can't prove they lied, I don't have to. I'm not the one asserting that they told the truth. You are. The burden of proof is 100% on your shoulders. You have to prove that these tales happened as described, and you just can't do that. It doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter what you have faith in. It matters what you can demonstrate. So you'd better get to work. Third, though, even if everything said was true, let's just let them have it for the moment, it still proves nothing about the veracity of Christianity because their beliefs don't prove truth. It only proves that they believed it, and they could be wrong. This is just leaping to conclusions that are not justified by the facts. Well, there must have been a UFO in that comet's tail because the Heaven's Gate members, they wouldn't die for a lie, would they? It really is that stupid. It gets you absolutely nowhere.
It also goes a long way in explaining why Christianity still exists today.
Nope, that was Constantine. Christianity was a pathetic little cult until Constantine mandated it throughout the most powerful empire of the day. Then it got carried on by the swords and shields of every Roman soldier throughout the known world, followed closely by the missionaries, who took advantage of the newly conquered people by insisting that they not only adopt Roman rule, but Roman religion as well. And that's why Christianity survived. If Constantine's mother and wife hadn't converted, then it's unlikely that we'd see Christianity as more than a historical curiosity today. The truth of it had nothing to do with it in any way, shape, or form. It just didn't.
The earliest followers watched their leaders, the founders of the movement, go to their graves, proclaiming this message to be true, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, which gave them the courage to carry on their legacy in the face of the persecution that they too would face.
That's all just tales the church tells you because they've got their hands out for your money. It's an emotional appeal to keep butts in seats and the collection plates moving. It's an example of people who believed stuff, who went out and did things motivated by those beliefs. But we have many, many, many examples of that across the world in many religions, and that doesn't prove that those religions were true, any more than it proves that yours was true. This is just an example of human irrationality. Humans doing dumb stuff for dumb reasons because they're running on pure fifis and faith and nothing else. And that is not something to be proud of. And I'm not sure why you are.
And that's going to sum up my case for why I believe the very existence of Christianity today serves as good evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth.
And it failed miserably. This has all been, I really, really, really like the mythology, so I'm going to pretend it means something because it really makes me feel good to think it's true. But that means absolutely nothing. You actually have to demonstrate with evidence that any of this stuff is real, and you just can't. The best you can do is show that people were dumb enough to believe it. But that doesn't prove any of it really happened. You are vastly overstating your case. There's a standard of evidence that you need to meet, and you're not even trying. This is just leaping to conclusions that are not justified by the facts, and sorry, but that is not remotely impressive. The only thing that the continued existence of the church proves is that the church has survived. By that token, Islam has to be right too, right? It's still out there, and it's growing, unlike Christianity, which is hemorrhaging members left and right, or Hinduism, which has been around for about 3,000 years. Jainism has been around as long as Judaism. Does that make that true? Because I really don't think you're going to agree, are you? After that, he just goes back and recaps, but I think we're going to skip it because we've already torn his entire premise apart end to end. This is really the problem with all of the apologists who desperately try to overreach their own claims. They get to a certain point, some earlier than others, some later, and then they just make a bum rush for the end zone screaming, "I was right all along!" No, you actually have to defend each of these points rationally. You have to be able to provide evidence for every step in the process. They know they can't do that. That's the problem. So they go as far as they can. They make a bunch of unsupported assertions, not defended by any concrete data, and then they say, well, I was right all along because that's what they really want to be true, when they are anything but. You can't just assert stuff. You can't just assume stuff. You can't just believe. You have to be able to prove. You have to be able to provide evidence. And they absolutely can't do any of it. That's why it's all just a gigantic argument from ignorance. I don't get it, therefore God. But that doesn't mean anything. You have to prove God first, not assert God, not assume God, not have faith in God. Prove it with evidence every single step of the way. This is why Christianity exists, was destined to fail, because the existence of a belief doesn't prove the truthfulness of the claims that belief system makes. It's the truth that matters, and you need evidence to demonstrate that truth. Now go back to square one and try again. Come back when you have the evidence that you need to prove that any of the things you believe are actually true. If you want me to evaluate your next effort, just let me know, because I'm always happy to oblige. Anyway, that was it. I wanted to thank the Epitome one last time for asking me to take this on. It was fun, even if it didn't work out so well for his side. So, what do you think? Did he have any worthwhile points? Let us all know down in the comments. This is really why the religious fail, because they're so desperate to get to something that they find emotionally comforting that they're willing to skip a lot of important steps along the way. And I'm just pointing out all of the things that they missed and all of the options they're ignoring because I don't have a vested interest in their religion like they do. That's why it's so important to be able to step back and look at these things dispassionately. That's where you figure out where you're going wrong. You need to stop caring where you end up, so long as where you end up is rationally and evidentially supported. So long as where you end up is the truth, the demonstrable truth. And in this case, it's just not. But we can reset and try again, right? So I encourage the epitome to go and do just that. Good luck in your future endeavors. Try to learn from your mistakes and improve. And I'll see you all next time.